Welcome to Tisky Sour. Even though it's hideously hot in the studio, in one way I'd prefer not to be here, but at the same time I'm very excited about tonight's show because we try and bring you disagreements on Tisky Sour. We have a lot of people from the Labour right, centrists versus leftists, etc. We've had someone from the Brexit party. What we've never had before is a Conservative MP. So it's quite exotic to have you here today.
It's the first time I've been called exotic, I must say.
This is Gillian Keegan, MP for Chichester. You've come on the show because we met 2 weeks ago, I think, on LBC.
Yeah.
Got into a sort of hour-long barney afterwards about right-wing versus left-wing economic policy. I have to say, Gillian was a little bit better on detail than me, so I thought I'd bring in the godfather of Corbynomics to have this debate properly. James Meadway, ex-advisor to John McDonnell, MP, the Shadow Chancellor.
Nice to be back.
You're kind of a regular on the show now, aren't you, really?
Well, yeah, because you asked me on slightly last minute for this thing. But yeah, okay. So
we did FM last Friday as well. I think it was quite a good show.
He asked me ages ago.
Oh, there you are. Well, it's priorities, isn't it? There you are.
Our audience probably know James. They probably don't know you. So I want to start with a bit of an introduction. You were an MP, first elected in 2017 for Chichester. How did you become the Tory party candidate in 2017? What's your story?
Well, somebody asked me to stand, actually. There's this campaign, cross-party, called Ask Her to Stand, to try and get more women involved in politics. And that campaign, a Conservative peer, Baroness Anne Jenkin, basically goes around the place looking for people that she thinks might be mad enough to decide they'll be an MP. And randomly, it's super random, I was at the theatre watching some play or other, and in the interval, I met someone I knew from the Japanese business world, because I'd worked in Japan a lot, and he introduced me to her, and she said, have you ever thought of being an MP? Which I thought was a bit random, but I said no, I hadn't. And I was at the point, I'd worked for about close to 30 years in various businesses all over the world, really, and I was at the point where I was looking for my second career, something different. I'd kind of already scratched that itch, as it were, and I wanted to do something different and something that was more purposeful, and that's why I thought, actually, this fits. This fits as the next job, next career, if I can get the shot. And I spent the next 4 and a bit years trying to see if I could get there.
And are you a lifelong Conservative?
Yeah, I am, which is very unusual because I grew up in Knowsley in Merseyside, and I was having a drink actually with the Knowsley MP last night, George Howarth. He has a 42,214 majority.
Is he Labour, presumably?
He's Labour, yeah. And, it makes my seat look like a marginal. It's a super, super safe seat. And my mum and dad still live there. In fact, all my family still live there. I've got a massive family. So, I just basically, having a drink with him and ever since I was, I guess we're all shaped by our experiences, which our political experiences. So I really should be a Labour supporter, I guess, from where I grew up. And most of my family, my granddad was a miner, my nan worked in the local biscuit factory, Huntley Palmers, and the other one was a dinner lady, and the other one worked in construction. Everyone lived in council houses. I come from that background, but my experience was shaped because I'd left school at 16, started an apprenticeship in a car factory in Kirby, which is, in Knowsley. And it was a highly unionised car factory, and it was where I saw all the worst type of union behaviour. There are some good examples of union behaviour, but it wasn't there in the car manufacturing industry in Merseyside in the 80s. And then I was studying at the same time because they sponsored me to do a degree. So I used to go 1 day a week to Liverpool, John Moores, the poly. And and basically I was learning all about globalisation and thinking, these two just do not work together. And then I had the perfect example of Liverpool City Council.
What two? Trade unionism and globalisation?
Yeah, in terms of what the trade unions were advocating at that time and what they were trying to stick to, the working practices they were trying to stick to, the changes they were unwilling to accept, and globalisation, as though you could stop it. I think that was the kind of the thought process. And then I had the example of Liverpool City Council being run by Derek Hatton and co. And I just thought, you know what, I'm not willing to just accept that this is the right answer. I'm going to look more deeply into it. And the more and more I looked into it, I realised that actually I'm probably naturally pro-business, and that's where I ended up getting more conservative in terms of what's the right answer. I think everybody in politics wants to make a difference and wants to do the right thing, but the question is what you think is the right answer to get there.
Right, I'm sure James is going to have a lot to say about trade unions, globalisation, and whether joining the Tory party is the right response to militant. But first of all, I want to just keep getting to know you a bit more. Yeah. So in terms of the Conservative Party, where do you position yourself? Obviously, there's a leadership election going on at the moment? Are you Boris Johnson? Are you Jeremy Hunt?
I supported Rory Stewart, so I actually introduced him at his launch. And, you know, it's funny because I went through all the leadership candidates and was, you know, basically asking them what their plan was. You know, Brexit's a very difficult thing to have a plan for in a hung parliament. So I was trying to get to some logical answers. And I really didn't think that I'd back someone like Rory. You know, he is, you know, kind of... I mean, super smart, super intelligent, but, you know, he doesn't have a similar background in any way to me. But I really liked him. I liked everything about his style. So I backed him. And since he was knocked out, obviously there was only one more day, so I haven't really backed.
Oh, so you haven't endorsed?
No, I haven't. And the reason I haven't is because so far... you know, I'm still not 100% clear of the plans, and that's because it's very difficult to navigate. And I understand what they're trying to do because it's a very unusual selectorate where you've got to get past the Conservative membership as well as appeal to the country and be able to run the country. And I understand that, as well as appeal to Conservative MPs as well. So it is a difficult balance. So no, I'm just waiting to kind of figure out what they do. I mean, obviously, I'll endorse and back whoever gets the...
But it's fair to say you're not a fan of Boris Johnson. That was the impression I got on LBC the other day.
Well, it's not that I'm not a fan of his, but I questioned some of his plans. And what I've said, you know, a lot of it comes around this no deal, do or die, leaving on the 31st of October. And having worked for many years in international business, I really do understand this. I mean, I worked in a car factory for 8 years. When people talk about integrated supply chains, I knew that was going to be a problem. You know, I've worked in banking, I've worked in technology, I've worked in travel industry. So a lot of industries that are highly international, that are really affected, I know, because I worked in them. And when someone just basically just, you know, says slogans like no deal, I find that, you know, difficult to accept. I think basically, if you want to do that, if you want to leave without a deal, you need to come up with a plan. You need to work out who's impacted, and you need to mitigate those impacts. So that's basically my message to both of them. And in fact, the One Nation Tories, which tend to be, you know, I'm kind of much more moderate, centrist, conservative. I'm not particularly right wing at all. But if you know that kind of view, we did send a letter to both of the candidates saying, you know, you have to spell out this plan. To which they both come back and said, yeah, they would.
And you were Thatcherite. I mean, because that's probably the biggest faction, or not necessarily a faction, because there's a consensus really within the Conservative Party, right, that Thatcherism was necessary for the British economy.
I think, I mean, no, you can't come from Liverpool and describe yourself as a Thatcherite, to be honest. And she appealed to me in terms of some of the messages, because I honestly recognised that some of the things that we had to go through in terms of changing and shifting our economy, they had to be done. I could recognise that even as a 16, 17, 18-year-old working in a car factory. So I could see that. But of course, you know, the question that I would always have is, you know, deindustrialisation, the change in our economy, the change in the industry had a massive impact on where I grew up in the north, and actually much more effort should have been made to regenerate those areas. Now, there was efforts to regenerate them, but not enough in my view. And clearly, you know, I worked and lived there, and you know, I describe myself as a Scouser before I describe myself as, you know, any political kind of persuasion. So I saw exactly what it did, but I didn't ever look at it emotionally from a perspective of, you know, I'm ideologically, you know, a Thatcherite. Not at all. No.
All right, so we're going to get into the nitty-gritty now, the ideological debate. So yeah, I was thinking we'll go back to first principles, actually, not talk about what's happened in the last week or the last 2 weeks. This is the first time we've had a Conservative MP on the show. So I want you to start with your pitch. Boris Johnson is going to be the next Prime Minister, for all intents and purposes. I'd be very surprised if that doesn't happen. In the next general election, given all that we know about Boris Johnson, why should voters... I mean, I don't think many people who watch our show are actually going to be considering voting the Conservatives. But for the sake of argument, why should people be voting for Boris Johnson's Conservatives to run Britain?
Well, I do think it's important that Boris sets out his plan because, there's a lot of talk about Boris and there's different Borises, right? There's the mayoral Boris, there's the journalist Boris, there's the Brexit lead campaigner Boris. And I think it's very important that Boris says what Boris is going to be and what Boris is going to do. So that's the first thing. And he will have to do that because, whilst campaigning is different, you do have to lay out your plan. I suspect, and I very much hope that he will be what Conservatives usually are, which is sensible, pragmatic, and will come up with a solid plan. I would very much expect that he would do that. He has to unite the party. Brexit has been very difficult for both of the major political parties. In fact, it's been difficult across the country because people really are split down the middle, and it's been incredibly difficult. So, and trying to work out how to do it in a hung parliament is incredibly difficult as well. So that's created the need for unity in both main political parties, and I think that's what he has to do first and foremost. So, what will his plan be? Well, his plan will be, the economy, and I guess we're going to get into the very, very big differences in terms of the philosophy that you have. But the economy is doing quite well in terms of overall growth, employment, etc. Now, of course, that means it's not good enough on many areas because the whole process of government, unlike a business, is it's continuous improvement. You have to build on build. It's never good enough. You can never spend money wisely enough. You never have enough money to spend on what you want, but you really just have to incrementally improve things. So I would expect his plan will be keep the economy growing, keep the employment growing, ensure people earn more. There's a lot to do. We've got social care to fix. We've got housing to fix in terms of making sure there's enough housing, of the right type of housing in the right places. We've got education to fund more. We've obviously put the funding now to the NHS, which is worth an extra nearly 34 billion pounds per year. But we need to make sure that that's spent wisely. Today we were having a debate about mental health, and in particular children's mental health. We have an aspiration for parity with mental health, but we are nowhere near delivering it. So all of these things still need to be done and still need to be fixed. So there's a lot of work to do, and Brexit has sucked the life out of British politics for too long, and we really do need to get on and deliver some of those things. So I would expect his pitch will be similar to that. I'll be interested to see whether the tax cut, his controversial tax cut for the kind of middle earners, whether that survives or not, or if it does, what he does for the lower earners. Are you against
the tax cut?
It's not where I'd prioritise. I would probably prioritise lower earners. Like we've already, lifted the... When you start to pay tax from, I think it was just under 7,000 under Labour, it's now 12,500. So people keep more of their own money. But that is always where you need to fix the issues. And today I was talking, we have an all-party parliamentary group on social care, on professionalising the workplace there, with some really good unions and with Louise Haigh, who's the Sheffield Heeley MP. So we were talking to people who do that job. And, they clearly don't get paid enough for the value of the service they provide. And we really do have to do a lot to professionalise and build up that sector. All
right, I'm going to bring in James now, godfather of Corbynomics.
I've not christened you that
before, and that's now your name, all right?
Okay.
Not your name, your title. You can keep your name.
Thank you.
Right, you've been masterminding a radically different plan for the British economy. The Tories have been in power for 9 years. Why should we take a risk with Corbynomics?
Because we've taken a risk. I mean, the story that we've had success for the last 8-9 years now, particularly since austerity really kicked in, I think doesn't match up with the experience that people have had. I mean, if you take economic growth, has there been economic growth since 2010? Yes, just about. I mean, it's about the slowest recovery in British history still. It's been unimpressive overall. But if you look at where that growth has occurred, 22% growth in London from 2010, 8% in the northwest, right, 4% in the northeast. Right? This is a serious maldistribution of the proceeds of growth, just in terms of different bits of the country, to say nothing of how much people are earning. And if you look at the figures that the ONS provided over last year, that you see the majority of the growth that's taking place in terms of incomes going to the top 10%, people below on the bottom 50% or so not seeing any improvement or even seeing declines in their income. Average wages barely above, they're basically below what they were in 2010 still, average real wages after you take account of all this. So I don't see much success out of that, and that's before you factor in the the consequences of austerity socially. The 120,000 excess deaths that the British Medical Journal reports, the increase in homelessness, 160%, an extraordinary ripping apart of some of the fundamentals of British society. This nasty way it's slowly eaten into the fabric of British society. And it's not really me saying that. That's the UN Special Rapporteur saying this. So if you say, OK, why are we taking a risk? We've taken a risk and it hasn't worked, right? And I don't view it as a risk to say, in line with, by this point, any mainstream economic commentator, anybody, from the IMF to find the people in the various universities in London who say austerity is a bad idea, you should make it stop. So that's your first port of call. Where you get into the deeper problem is that, look, we took a risk with Thatcherism. We took a risk, and what it builds up over a long period of time, over 30, 40 years, the deregulation, the massive transfer of wealth to the top of society, the destruction of manufacturing that we talked about, the reduction of trade unions to, sort of almost an incidental feature in British life, the shift in power and the balance of power in workplaces towards only the people at the top and not the people who do work. You put all that together and what you end up with is this spectacular explosion in 2008 of a deregulated version of capitalism, the massive build-up of debt and all the consequences we've seen from that. So we had the experiment. It's time to do something different. I think with the series of social problems we have, austerity is the first one. We just have to stop imposing these spending cuts. As far as I can tell, by the way, Jeremy Hunt and Boris Johnson both agree with this. They both come out with great big plans for spending. So hopefully austerity is now over and we can talk about what we're going to spend the money on to try and patch up some of the mess. The second one is how do we actually give people good, secure jobs that involve them having better pay, better conditions, something at work that they can look forward to rather than sort of the misery of 0-hour contracts and the rest of it. And the third one, I suppose, is climate change and what we're going to do about climate change and the fact that, as you said, we're sitting here sweltering away in this studio, sweltering away in the rest of the country over the last few days, the extraordinary extreme weather events we've seen. We have to do something about this. So I think at the centre of what a Labour government would do is how do we decarbonise the economy? How do we create good, secure, green jobs across the whole country, not just concentrated, as they have been for too much of the last few years in London and the South East? And how do you start to put all that in place? That's a kind of broad brush outline of this. I don't view this as radical. I don't view this as a huge, wild experiment. This, to me, is like, here are the problems that we face, and here's how we're going to deal with them. And I think if you look at the evidence of 2017, we'll see what happens in the next election, that can be a very popular programme for government.
How much do you agree with all of that? I mean, you sound like quite a centrist Tory in the sense that you don't seem to be that in favour of Thatcherism or austerity, etc. What James is talking about is reversing many of the harshest elements of Thatcherism, which unchained capital, as it were, and created enormous inequality, and then reversing austerity. I mean, what of what James has said do you think is
I think
is a problem?
I think in terms of nobody ever says, I really want a bit of austerity. Could I have a little bit more austerity, please? Nobody, no government wants to ever be in power in a period where you have to cut expenditure. And I think the question you always have to ask is, are you happy with the fact that Britain was borrowing £1 for every £4 we spent? Are we happy, and this is when we came into power, are we happy that we pay in interest debt alone just over £50 billion, which is about as much as we spend, well, it's more than we spend on the whole education budget, it's more than we spend on defence, it's like a huge big department really. Are we happy that, and that's dead money, right? Every year, dead money. And that's when we've got low interest rates. And if you had higher interest rates, that 50 billion could easily go up to 80 or 100 billion. And that was the situation we were facing. So we'd had this, this spending pattern, and we had, that was what we were given. One pound in every four was borrowed. The cost of that borrowing was 50 billion. If interest rates moved, that would be 80 billion. So that is a huge department, or two departments potentially, complete spending, all going in dead money. That was what we were trying to do. We were trying to basically say we have to bring this into some kind of manageable place, because spending that amount, and we still have a big interest charge. I think we spend about 20 billion now, 22 or 3, I think it is. We've obviously reduced the deficit, but the other side of the austerity is not only is it the fact that we were trying to wrestle with that kind of financial picture, but it was also that actually we have quite a changing need as well. We've got a lot more elderly people and living a lot longer with more complex needs. And if you look at almost every spending driver, a lot of it is driven by that. Housing, people are living longer and staying in houses, which is great, right? That's what we want them to do. Hospitals, obviously, there's more and more elderly people. If I look at my local hospital, something like more than 85% of the patients are over 85. So the whole sort of nature of the people that we're trying to serve with public services is changing. And that's the other pressure that you have. And we haven't got the right models in place. So what you end up doing is spending more money badly. And that's another thing we have. So, for example, you have a lot of people who are in very costly beds in the hospital when actually they should be in a much better service, which is actually also much cheaper and much better for them in some kind of care system or care home, or maybe being cared for at home with the right model. And what you've got is, because those big things haven't been fixed, you're in this kind of stochastic place where you're wrestling with this massive debt, but the drivers are basically meaning that you're constantly putting more money into what's a very expensive model and not even providing the right service in many counts. So I think you've got to look at the problem you have and then deal with it. And it's been incredibly difficult to deal with. Now, I think local councils have had a lot of the cuts.
60% cuts, I think, right?
Yeah, in some cases.
To council budgets.
Yeah, in some cases that's true. And you know, you look at that and think, well, why does that make any sense? And I think there's been two things going on, because if you actually look at local authorities and local governments, and they do differ massively across the country, but what you've got in many cases, if I take my own area, there's been a lot of talk about whether having a county council and 8 district councils and all those layers of governance is actually a good model or not. Nobody knows which ones do which services. They spend at least a lot of time arguing over who should be doing what. There's a lot of budget brinkmanship between various departments because it's not very clear in some cases. So, you know, have we got the right models? But you try to get any reform or change and then, you know, people don't really want to change. You look at the reserves, you know, some of these councils have got massive reserves. Some of them don't. I accept that. That's again not a uniform picture. So they're very different. And I think what the government was trying to do was it was trying to say, you know, get yourselves reform and be more efficient, be more, you know, try to manage some of these things better, and that actually hasn't really worked, because really what you're asking people to do is reform themselves, and that's always incredibly difficult to do. So, and also you normally need to invest in those reforms as well. So it's not been particularly successful. But if you look also at what really is driving a lot of the council pressures, it's exactly the same thing. Adult social services is actually the biggest bill almost all of them have, and they can't control it because there's many more people. They have a statutory duty, and there's many more people that need it, and there will be. So we definitely need to fix that model.
So I think we want a response from James now, but I think to summarise, you've got three justifications for austerity. One is to get the debt under control. Two is that you think the state had obligations which were sort of based on an out-of-date welfare state, so money was going to the wrong places. And three, to kind of discipline the public sector, because you thought that they were wasting money.
Well, but I think you always need to have financial discipline, because it's actually not our money, right? It is taxpayers' money. Government do not have any money. They just have taxpayers' money.
Yeah. James?
Look, I mean, to return to a point, I suppose, the issue with austerity is that it is a choice. Right, and it's a deliberate choice undertaken at the time in 2010 and then stuck to through thick or thin, and is really a huge amount of thin by this point. That you can see the choice. You can see the choice where you say, well, we had all this debt, so we had to try and pay it off, and that's presented as the case. Then at the same time, you have an extraordinary amount of tax cuts for corporation tax, for capital gains taxes, totaling about £110 billion by the end of this parliament. So the choice is fairly clear at that point. The choice is to say, well, we're going to argue about the need to repay this debt as rapidly as possible. Actually, we're just going to cut a load of corporation tax and cost a great deal of money on the official forecasts at the same time. So it's not simply that we had to do these things. There was a choice to do these things, and it's the nature of that choice and the way it plays out that I and lots of other people find so unsettling. I mean, if you talk about council cuts and what's happened, it is not the case that every single council has suddenly got the same amounts of cuts and they all have to deal with it. Like some of the poorest councils in the country, Knowsley is one of them. Knowsley has been one of the worst affected by this. It has had bigger cuts than some of the richest parts of the country. Now, fairly basically, that isn't fair, right? It isn't fair to say some of the most deprived areas in the country, you will have the really big cut, whereas someone that isn't so deprived, in fact, it's actually quite well off, you won't have a cut, or even you'll suddenly find that you've actually got a bit of a surplus there. So this is not a good way to do this. If we accept the thing about, actually we need to reform local government, well, okay, perhaps we do need to reform local government. Perhaps that should be on the basis of giving people more control over a budget that they have, giving people an expanding budget to be able to spend on the services you mentioned, like social care and the rest of it, which I agree does need to be funded properly. It does need to be funded properly. But it's finding ways to do that on the basis that this is a rich country that can afford to do these things, that we're going to make a choice to make sure that our public sector and our public services are funded properly. And that ultimately is the first choice that I think people are going to be confronted with. Certainly they were confronted with in 2017, and they're going to be confronted with in the next election.
And specifically the debt question. What's your answer to the debt question?
Well, the debt question, if you take the 2008-2009 into 2010, this very big expansion of the deficit, the rise in the debt and all the rest of it, the reason that happens is because you have a massive recession. You have a massive recession, and quite correctly, this is the right thing to do. Quite correctly, the government continued to spend because that's what keeps the economy ticking over. That's what sets a floor in the recession, and that means you're borrowing money to make that happen. Now, if you have a massive recession, which is driven by a fall in spending in the private sector, that is the driver of the recession in 2008-9. The idea that government then turns up and says, hey, we're going to cut our spending as well, only makes the recession worse. That if you want to guarantee a slow recovery, and it's been a particularly slow and very strange so-called recovery out of this crash, then government lurching off and immediately cutting in the way that it did, I think is the worst way to do that. If you want to seriously reform the economy, if you want to seriously get into some of the changes here, we need to get out of what we've created over the last few years, building on some of the worst features of British capitalism in the last 40 years, is a low wage, low investment, low productivity economy. We do not have much investment. We do have low wages for far too many people in insecure work, and we do have strikingly, dramatically low productivity, and that is the real driver of any future growth. Now, if you're going to address that, you don't start by saying, let's do austerity, let's try and correct the economy around this thing, whilst incidentally cutting corporation taxes in particular. You say, how are we going to deliver the investment? How are we going to restructure the economy? How are we going to shake out some of the bad practices we've seen in the City of London and our financial system in general? How are we going to get to deliver for people on the ground rather than, creating all these new derivatives and all the rest of it? How do we start to turn the whole thing around, change the structure of the economy so it delivers for people in places like Knowsley, and it's not just about delivering for people just down the road from here in the City of London? That is a fundamental question. That's one I think that we need to start addressing. I don't see that coming from the Tory party at this point in time, and I don't think they've ever seriously got into the nuts and bolts. Perhaps a few people have raised issues like this, but they've never got into the nuts and bolts of how do we make this economy work better for most people. And that doesn't mean carry on doing what you were doing before and tweak it a bit. It means you're going to have to do something fundamental. How do you drive up investment? How do you deliver that across the whole country? How do you deliver good, solid, secure, high productivity, high wage jobs across the whole country? That isn't going to happen just doing what we've done in the past.
Well, obviously I would not have the same analysis, and you've still got to work out what you do with the dead money, how you get rid of dead money, because I think the 50 billion, if you're spending your way,
dead money, interest payments,
yeah, it's not creating anything for the economy. So if you continue to spend your way out of it, then your 50 billions, 80 billions, 100 billions, 200 billion, I don't know what it is, but it's certainly money that's going, and that's whilst the interest rates are low. In terms of corporation tax, so this is something that's often thrown at us, well, you've given big business a tax cut. The corporation tax cut that we gave raised an extra £4 billion for the Treasury. And most people, nobody wants to give tax cuts to anybody, actually. Treasury want to get tax in so that they can spend it and they can afford to spend it. But what they look at when they try to do these things is to look at what actually is the optimal take, the Laffer curve. What is the optimal take? If I put the tax threshold up, or if I put the rate down, do I actually get higher returns? Do I have more money coming in? I think where we would agree is on productivity. Productivity is low in the country.
And you think that was a failure of the Tory government from 2010?
I don't think anyone's addressed it, but I think what it actually is a failure of is decades of failure in investments in skills and the right skills. And of course also super fast broadband is now the fourth utility.
But presumably, I think probably James shares an analysis that New Labour weren't particularly good on productivity, but cutting investment is probably one of the worst things you can do, right?
Well,
if you're aiming to increase productivity.
Well, the
in the economy.
investment in productivity, so the investment in broadband rollout has continued. Actually, it's an investment which is incentivised by the government, but it's largely taken by the private sector. In terms of the investment in transport, obviously there's been more investment in trains and transport infrastructure than ever before, so that's been a huge increase. The green, we mentioned climate change, which is vitally important. We do have now lots more investment in solar renewables. We've got I think it's the largest offshore wind business or onshore. I don't know which one. I wrote in a speech the other day and I read it the other day. But we've got a lot of we're creating some really exciting areas. Do we need to do more of that, and do we need to do that more quickly? Yes. Has Brexit got in the way? Yes. There is a lot that needs to be done. But if you look at also the moving things around the country, I think is also very important. Coming obviously from the Northwest, I'm very passionate about the Northwest, and I left the Northwest when the jobs dried up, basically. But you look at the package of if you lived in the Northwest now, and we were talking about this. All my young cousins, even if they went to university or they didn't go to university, they are still buying their first house with their partners in their 20s. Why? Because the whole package is affordable. The differential now between salaries is much lower than it was when I moved in the 80s. London, you got paid a lot more. Technology has made that much easier to have different types of jobs and different skills.
So is your claim that regional inequality has decreased?
No, but that the opportunity for it to decrease has never been better because of technology. But actually, a lot of people in the South, and I'll say this the same about our own boys, they think they're going to dissolve if they go up north. They seriously do. Even if you look at immigration into this country, right, most people stay in and around the southeast. That's why Scotland doesn't have a problem with immigration, because there's very few people go, and they would love to have more people go. So I think there are massive differences, and when we're looking at all these problems, we need to segment them. Council housing, we need a load more council housing in Chichester. Clearly we need more social housing in London, but I'm pretty sure in Knowsley they probably have enough social housing, and they want to have more slightly different types of housing to get more people with council taxes who can pay more council taxes, etc. So they probably want a different offer, and I know that's for sure true, because they also want to attract key workers, head teachers, and all those things that make a massive difference. So I think what you need to look at, it's incredibly complex. We're talking about whole economies here. It's incredibly complex. You can always spend more. You can always do more. But I think, and of course, we need to factor in the Brexit part of it, which we'll get onto later. But I think that there are many things that have happened, that are happening. But I am personally convinced that the Conservative manifesto, which actually wasn't so great in 2017, will be the right offer for the country whenever the next election is.
I want to go on to Labour's positive offer in a moment, but first of all, there was a lot to respond to there. So we've got dead money. What's your answer about dead money? Tax cuts actually made money.
Yeah,
the Tories actually were quite good at investing around the economy.
No,
what's your answer?
I dispute that. The on the tax cuts making money, the OBR, the Office Budget Responsibility, the official forecast is the same thing from Revenue and Customs. Very clear. Massive corporation tax cuts means a lot of losses on corporation tax. If you look at the pattern of business investment, this might be the claim you want to make. We cut corporation tax, we get loads of investment, therefore we kind of make good the amount of corporation tax, but that hasn't happened, right? So the figures on it are clear. Like I said, 110 billion.
Well, we need to fact check that, because actually I think it's 4 billion extra.
I'm not sure where that comes from.
From the Treasury. I did work there for a bit.
All right. So same. All right. Okay. We have a lot in common.
I worked there a few months ago.
Okay. So in a slightly more lofty role than me, I suspect. So it was 110 billion pounds lost from corporation tax from those cuts they made. And if you think about it, that's not completely. That shouldn't be surprising. That if you levy a tax rate that is already low, and then you cut it on the grounds that this has to be competitive to being like the lowest in the G7, you continue cutting it. Why is this going to produce more investment when at the same time you are not delivering the investment needed by government? And it has to be government on big infrastructure and like the real sort of physical capital investment across the whole country. And I think we'd agree on the need to do that, but it isn't happening at the minute. If you take transport spending per head,
quite a lot in
transport spending per head in London is what, £1,000, £1,000 and a bit. Transport spending per head in the north is £528, right? So that's a huge old gap that you're going to have to close in one way or the other. Now, I'm not suggesting you're going to spend money willy-nilly, but there are actually good local councils, good schemes of how you might start to do this, turn those economy rounds. That is on the most basic, if you like. It's even a pro-business offer at this point, right? Because you're actually doing something that's going to deliver growth in the most basic way possible that isn't happening because of decisions taken in the Treasury, because the institution of the Treasury isn't very good at thinking like this. This is one of the institutional changes you're going to have to make. If we're talking about dead money, and money that isn't being done for everything, take the more than 750 billion sitting in company bank accounts, right? This is cash at hand that is now at record levels. This is money they are not spending. This is money they are not investing. This is despite all the tax cuts. This is what's happened over the last few years in this country.
I think Brexit might be having a little bit
but this has been going on way before Brexit. This you can date it. It starts to happen particularly dramatically after the financial crisis, but it really accelerates after 2010. So we do these tax cuts. We don't get the investment. We have a low rate of investment. We have business investment that's lower this year than it was last year. This is despite the tax cuts. If you think investment's the problem, you're not addressing it.
It's a different thing. It's a completely different thing. So businesses invest to get a return, right? They don't invest because of a tax cut necessarily. You might get more businesses coming here. What you're actually competing with your corporate tax rate is not inward investment here. It's basically whether some business locates itself here or locates itself in Ireland or locates itself in France or locates itself in Warsaw. And, I've spent many, many years on the end of these decisions, reviewing these decisions, analysing these decisions. They're very complex decisions, actually. They look at skills, they look at labour rates, they look at legal systems, they look at labour arbitrage, they look at prior investment, they look at, depending on what it is, they'll look at many, many factors. The one thing they look at is their overall tax position, and actually usually in a multinational company they will be looking at transfer pricing and all that kind of stuff. It's incredibly complex, but the reason that they make investment decisions, and actually we do get most of the foreign direct investment that comes into Europe comes into the UK still, despite Brexit. So we are an attractive place for business investment. We have to keep being an attractive place for business investment, because without that business investment, we simply do not have the jobs so that people are paying tax. We do not have the corporation tax, or we do not have the value being created. And, the reason I'm conservative is I've always been much more conscious of the value creation side is the tough bit. Working out how you're going to spend money. I've never had a problem working out how to spend money. And as I say, you can always spend more. The value creation and how you create the right conditions to do that, which you're right, you've never done enough. Productivity is always an ongoing challenge, although the way we measure it probably isn't also fit for today's economy. You're absolutely right. In the north, the investment in transport isn't enough. And there was a debate yesterday on HS2 and whether HS3 should be prioritised or at least Crossrail, the Crossrail for the north be prioritised. There's many northern MPs, including Conservatives, calling for that. I personally think there is a massive case for that, and also increasing the capacity. But they have been increasing, upgrading the lines and electrification. All of that's been happening. There has been a lot of investment. But the key reason I think that I'm conservative and I'm not such a fan of Corbynomics is all of my experience in global business all across the world. I really don't see that gives businesses the right kind of confidence to invest in the country, and that's massively key. Now, and I'm not saying that lightly because, but it is absolutely vital. You have to be pro-business, because pro-business is what creates the wealth, in my view, unless you want to, just be, a completely planned economy, which I don't think there's a market for that in the UK.
Okay,
James, there's a lot to respond there, and I also want to get onto sort of the positive vision of Corbynomics, as well as debating the Conservatives' record. But first of all, you're watching Tysky Sour, you're watching Novara Media. As you know, this channel is only possible because of your kind support. If you are already a subscriber to Novara Media, thank you very much. You're what makes this possible. If not, please go to support.novaramedia.com and donate the equivalent of 1 hour's wage a month. I do hope you've brought in some Conservatives, so potentially there'll be some
1 hour might be a bit more,
packages
right?
coming our way. As ever, we want more people to watch this show, so please like this video on YouTube. Keep your comments coming. Share it on Facebook. Share it on Twitter. James,
Pro-business. All right. But look, I mean, Boris Johnson said "fuck business," right? He's not being pro-business.
I did not agree with that.
He's not being pro-business, but he's going to be your prime minister, right? I mean, I've got very little to do with choosing him, and likewise, Michael. But your member's going to likely.
It's good for the headline. I doubt it'll be a policy.
Well, it's hard to see what you might turn that into policy-wise. But you're talking about pro-business. You have a prime minister to be who talks like this. You're talking about being pro-business, and then sort of saying that it's not pro-business to say that we want to spend £250 billion over 10 years on capital spending that would be enough to get us. No, you're not going. It's big compared to what Britain has done historically, and certainly under this government. £20 billion worth of real terms capital cuts, real terms cuts to science spending under George Osborne. So you're certainly not going to do that. But moving from a situation where Britain is amongst the lowest public investors, and I mean in capital spending, infrastructure spending in the OECD, to about the OECD average, this isn't like anti-business. This isn't doing something wild. Lifting your corporation tax, your headline rate of corporation tax, to around about the same level, in fact slightly below Canada, right? Is Canada massively anti-business? No, of course not. So this isn't some wild radicalism. This is what I find always interesting. Like, you go and talk to Conservatives, there's something they think is happening that isn't there. I'm not seeing the anti-business part of this.
It's the Corbyn-McDonnell rhetoric that we've all had to listen to for the last 35 years.
Which is the rhetoric?
They're very anti-business. I mean, now John McDonnell's
said
obviously...
fuck business. John McDonnell has never said fuck business.
I agree, and that was...
Neither's Jeremy.
I'm sure he has, but I'm sure it's not been recorded in a headline. But I think... but, look, I've worked in business for so long, even before I knew John McDonnell and Jeremy Corbyn were. In fact, before everybody knew they were. They were just there voting no consistently for years, decades, not creating that much value apart from no votes. But, the reality is it is important to be pro-business, and yet saying fuck business is super unhelpful, and I say that direct to the camera, so hopefully Boris will take that on board.
It's your John McDonnell moment, breaking the third wall.
It's
You've
really,
already got free on camera,
but it's really not, it's a stupid thing to say. But I honestly think that the businesses do not have any confidence at all in the Corbynomic agenda at all. And that's your big challenge, and I'm sure that you'll be trying to resolve that between now and whenever the next election is. But it really is important that businesses think that they know what they're investing in, they know what the rules
Completely
are.
agree.
I mean, we've already challenged them enough by introducing Brexit into the mix, which has changed the rules potentially, and that's going to be difficult enough to manage. But they have to have certainty.
Could you be a bit more concrete about what it is specifically you think about Corbyn and McDonnell's programme that would scare business? Because at the moment you've got sort of what they've said over the last 35 years, but we can always dig up quotes from anyone. Is there anything in Labour's platform that you think is anti-business and that would stop business investing in the economy?
It's obviously the ideology, and I don't know how far it goes, but the nationalisation ideology and how far that goes and how it's enacted, which business sectors it applies to. There are many things that we need to do as well, like give more relief probably on capital investment and training, productivity led capital investment and skills training, because that would make sense. But I think I'm not an expert, but every time they talk about business, they're very anti-profits. Business is bad. I mean, I can tell. I listen to them all day long in the chamber. Not one of them, by the way, has spent a single day working in a business. That's the one thing I know. They'll sit there. They'll have worked in usually a union or local government.
That's not true. John worked in the television factory, I think was his first job.
How long for?
Long enough to have it as part of his career in that length.
Well,
of time,
honestly, I bet it's.
I mean, he went
really.
he went off to study afterwards, didn't he? He went as a mature student, but he worked in a television factory. He's worked all over the place.
Well, okay, I will have a look at John McDonnell's record. I must say I haven't really looked at his, but I've looked at Jeremy Corbyn's. So Corbyn, whatever he did, he went to a very nice private school, which my Knowsley Comprehensive School, I'm extremely jealous of, but I didn't get to do that. I left school at 16, started an apprenticeship. He went on, did some A-levels, which he didn't do or didn't finish or whatever. Then he did half a degree. Then he went to a union. Then he did another half a degree. He never did a full degree. Half plus half did not equal one in his case. Then he went and worked, I think, 3 years in a union. Then he stuck himself on the public purse's pay as a council officer, like I don't know if that was full time, and then he became an MP, and then he voted no for 3 decades. That is not if we were all like that, this would not be a highly productive nation.
It depends what you mean by productivity at that point.
That's not productive. What's productive about voting no?
Voting no to what? I mean, I think
everything
if you take
his government tried to do.
I think there's good reasons to do that, because let's have a look at the productivity
Well, it didn't
outcomes
change
that we've
anything.
seen under this
He
government.
just voted no to everything. This is the Labour government he voted no
Well,
to,
he
not the
didn't vote no to
Conservative.
everything
He
the Labour
voted
government did.
no
Come
to
on.
pretty much everything
If you
that
take
the
the
Labour
economic-
Party
if you take the
put
economic-
All right, let's have James respond.
Go on. If you take the economic setting of the last Labour government, which I have my own criticism of, I don't think either John or Jeremy would disagree with increasing spending. After years of being starved by the Tories,
They do when we ask them to.
increased spending on public services like the health service. Why is the NHS so widely respected today? It's basically because Labour sorted it out. Labour got the funding in there and made
More
the
than
thing work better.
2/3 of its life
than
has
it
been under
happened.
Conservative.
Hey, let him
It's true.
finish the point.
It's
eh?
absolutely true, and you haven't dared, I don't think, ever get rid of it, and that's a tribute to
We've
what a
never
great
wanted.
idea it is. We can come on to the positive parts of Corbynomics and what Corbyn stands for in a sec, if we're talking about delivering public services and delivering universal public services and all the rest of it. But if you look at the record of Jeremy Corbyn as Labour leader or John McDonnell as Shadow Chancellor, please show me where he's turned round and said, I am anti-business. It hasn't happened.
It's his
When he goes to
words have
speak
not
at the
matched his
CBI,
lifelong actions.
when he goes to speak at the CBI, yeah, all right. Do you want to talk about Boris Johnson? Because we're talking about some of his words don't match their actions. And
Lifelong actions.
Somebody has issues with that. We can do that all day with this man. So let's see what he actually says and what Labour actually stands for. Where in the programme is anything really anti-business? Because if you're saying corporation taxes will go up to a level, basically less than Canada, right? Not a
It's
massive.
not me you need to convince.
One of
it's
the lowest in the
businesses.
G7. Well, if we're going to talk about convincing businesses, there was a very interesting survey that the Centre for Policy Studies, it's a Tory think tank, conducted, showing that 60% of small businesses said that this government wasn't on their side. So perhaps everybody needs to do a bit of work to convince people on this. So that's something
that could again be Brexit related.
it could be. Well, there you go.
Brexit's
Well,
not
it could be related to the fact that you've got a leader who's touting no deal as a plausible option.
I think, yeah.
I don't know when it was done. Actually, the survey.
It was
in any
published
case,
March 2019.
I want to keep in a way to sort of like the big ideological questions.
Yeah, let's get back onto the big
I think
ideological
something
question.
that you've brought up, and I think something that is true and that is different about Labour's policy, is that you will have a state that plays a more active role in the economy, a state that has a more interventionist role, and that's what you're scared of. Because
No
you
one
think,
feels good about
because
that
you
if
think
you're in
there'll
a
be people
business.
who've never run a business in their life will be intervening in businesses' investment decisions. You think that's necessary for us to increase productivity in the economy. So maybe. I mean, is that correct? And if that is correct, can you sort of...
No, I mean, if you look at Labour's programme, which is to say that we would like to see investment we'd like to see investment across the rest of the country, and I don't think that's going to be something that can happen without a great deal of collaboration with the business community one way or the other, right? It has to look like this. It can't just be, and neither John nor Jeremy are keen on the model of somebody sitting in Whitehall and saying, this is where we're going to invest, these are the decisions, right? Neither of them are keen on a model of nationalisation, which is limited to really things that should never have been privatised, right? So railways, obvious one, water, electricity. You're going to bring these back in-house, but we're going to try and do this better, and we're going to do it differently,
And who
right?
makes all those decisions then, though? So if it's not Whitehall, what is it?
Well, if you take
Couple
the
of
model
unions,
for,
or,
if you take
or
the
John
model of
and John and
Well,
Jezza,
take the model of what we talked about in energy, right? If you actually seriously want to decarbonise the energy supply and you want to get lots and lots of renewables out there as rapidly as possible, renewable technology doesn't rely on like one big wind farm in the middle of the country. It's not like nuclear power or something. You have to disperse it. If you want it dispersed, the best, quickest way to do this is to provide some form of local ownership. You do what they're doing in Germany and Denmark. Again, this isn't like
we
wild
do have
radicalism.
some models of that
It is
at
happening.
council
So
level.
let's make
but
this happen more often, right?
In some cases
That's the
that
programme.
works, right? Why do we have to design it across the whole country like a single model?
Well, I
The
don't think we
reality
do.
is there's lots of different ownership
Do you think
structures.
privatisation of the railways worked?
I think you could argue. I mean, they were terrible before and they're bad now. So, there is.
I mean, even with all that hesitation, if what you're trying to tell the voter is that they should be terrified of the
I
fact that the
don't-
next Labour government wants to nationalise the railways,
It's
and
a
you
very
say,
popular
as
thing
a
by-
question of should it have been privatised in the first place,
I don't actually think it's the ownership model. I think actually the way that we've split the track and the train has been an issue. The way it was privatised potentially, but that's a learning that we now have, and there's now there's moves to change how that works. And you can always improve these things, but I don't think the answer is nationalisation. What's really at the heart of this desire is control, and people feeling more comfortable that they can control aspects of things. There's many ways you can get levels of control. You can incentivize certain behaviors, etc. We have just legislated to be carbon neutral in this country by 2050. Now, of course, Extinction Rebellion and others would like us to go faster, but that is still a global leading position. And we have got a serious plan, a lot of planning to do to meet that. So, all of the things we're talking about, I am pretty sure they will be part of the industrial strategy, the green industrial strategy, because we've legislated to do it. We have to do it. We've put ourselves under the cosh.
But you're now arguing for an industrial strategy, right? State involvement, state making decisions about investment in the country to increase productivity.
Well, you seed and source things. So yes, absolutely, and we do this now, right? I mean, universities. You mentioned university investment, but many of the universities have venture capital funds actually, which are actually funded or partially funded by the government in terms of the tax structures they've put in place. There's many different ways that these are incentivized, but state ownership is different, right? That's where you own it. And you know what my biggest fear of state ownership is? They'll cock it up and we'll end up with the hospitals competing with the railway companies, competing with the water companies for the same limited and ever decreasing funds. That's my biggest fear, because actually you then have the risk and responsibility fully for every bit of funding. And, businesses work very hard to make money. It isn't easy. And it's very hard to be terrible at business. And I just fear that you may be terrible at it.
That's not the experience of public ownership of key bits of the economy across the rest of Europe, across.
Well, they don't have Jeremy Corbyn and John McDonnell.
Well, this is where I think we're back.
I don't want to make it personal. I want this about the big ideologies.
You want to talk about the big picture. The big picture in this one is that plenty of other places do have public ownership of railways, of water, this sort of thing. We're an outlier. We're an outlier.
You could make an argument.
We're an outlier, and the public attitude to bringing those things back into public ownership, I think, is telling, right? So that does reflect the experience in the last 30 years. People aren't just thinking this out of some random, ideological desire. They're thinking it because they know what the experience of the railways, water, electricity, all the rest of it is like.
They've forgotten what it was like before, or they weren't.
No, I don't think that's it. I think they realise that there were problems before. I think you can take British Rail.
Let him finish a point. Come on, James.
You can take sort of British Rail and this sort of thing. Why was British Rail a problem? Because it was starved investment by government. So yes, which government was starving investment? Well, that was Thatcher. Somebody who's cropped up a couple of times this evening. Thatcher government starving of investment.
So the trains work brilliantly.
So finish your point.
So if you want to build in place a model of public ownership that works in the railways, there's other ways of doing it than the old British Rail model. There's no point sitting there and going we'll turn the dial back to some point in, take your pick, 1970s, 1950s. Absolutely no point whatsoever. What there is a need, quite pragmatically, is to say privatisation hasn't worked. What can we do that's better and different? And in addition, you touched on this, that if we're serious about dealing with climate change, if we do have a net carbon target for 2050 or sooner, then we do need to work out how we get there. And you use the word, we do need to have some degree of planning, and we do need to have some degree of saying this will happen, this won't happen. Now, I favour a decentralised version of this. I favour saying, okay, we have a big carbon target for the whole country, and we're going to decentralise decisions and how you get there to local authorities, to regional authorities, if we can get to that point, that we decentralise the thing. I mean, the most centralising government that we've had for more or less in British or recent modern British history was Margaret Thatcher's. It was Margaret Thatcher who deprived councils of their powers to make these sorts of decisions.
She decentralised to businesses. So, we decentralised to business. That's the difference, right? We decentralised to the private sector.
Yeah,
we tried to put the right investment models to encourage the private sector to take risky investments in new technology. But that is the model, not to other layers of government at any different level. So obviously devolution for public sector services is there, and that's going to continue. And I agree with you. The more we can do that, we've now got mayors in the north, the more we can seriously give more funding to the north to enable them, for public sector stuff. But the way you're really going to get some of this innovation is actually through the private sector. The private sector are the kings of innovation. And actually, this is where we started our discussion in Leicester Square, when you were basically claiming some book someone had written that claimed that all innovations came from the state somewhere or other.
Well, no, that book was Mariana Mazzucato's The Entrepreneurial State, and her argument isn't all innovations come from the state. She says all innovations have a big role for the state. So there's often state investment either in... often in the United States it was in the military-industrial complex, so many of the components of the iPhone, or obviously the internet, I think, came from the military, didn't it?
It did, yeah.
Or from the space race. Like many of the big innovations we have in the economy came from state investment, because there's not actually a quick buck to be made in any of these areas
or
of
also
the
because
economy.
you're trying to do something new. The space age is a great example, right? You're trying to do something new. When you try and do something new, you get innovation.
But that's the whole point of the mission-oriented industrial policy. And it's only a state who's able to do that, because it's only the state who can have a long enough term of vision and is also
Elon
willing
Musk's
to...
doing it now.
Actually, I'm going to go to you for that, James. So Mariana Mazzucato has this idea that it's only the state that can do mission-oriented industrial policy. How do you deal with Elon Musk?
How do you deal with Elon Musk? I don't think that's quite Mariana's argument. I think her argument is that innovation in practice is not something that's an entire property of the private sector, right? It's not just like, here's a private sector, it's going to invent stuff, and we just have more private sector, and that's where it comes from. Britain's quite a striking example of this, because if we're talking about innovation, we have had, over a long period of time, lots of funding for basic research relative to other kinds of, further down the line investment. And I say lots, this is relatively lots. Britain's rate of R&D spending is very, very low compared to other similar economies, right? One of the things you want to do is drive up the amount that government is spending on research. But I also think there's a need to say, actually, it's where you spend that money. If you want innovation, if this is what you want to go for, then what you need are institutions that are able to work with bits of the private sector to make that innovation happen. That's Mariana Mazzucato's argument, and I think that'll be accepted. I know it'll be accepted by John. So if you take something like the Fraunhofer Institutes in Germany, if you take basically government and publicly funded institutions that are able to get involved, not just in basic research, but get involved towards the development, towards the release to market stage.
Most
then
of
you
our
can really start to
universities
deliver
do this. All of our universities have research. In fact, the one that I went to when I went full-time back to uni after studying part-time, the first one, they have invested with the government and with private money and created a venture capital fund, which I've invested in, actually. And we've invested in 19 businesses, tech businesses. Some of them may not work out.
So you're saying it's
some of them
happening
will.
already?
It-
So the
it
kind of things
is.
that Mariana
The
Mazzucato
universities
talks about are
are
happening already in our universities.
And they have a lot of intellectual property that they are. Go to the British Library, and you've got teams of people there helping people register intellectual property rights. So yes, there are many different models. You don't need to prescribe the model. The model is, people are very incentivized to, to make some money, to be successful, to be able to buy a flat or a house. They're very, very individually, incentivized, and as long as you don't get in their way, they'll and you provide them with half decent skills, and then I think access to skills as you're getting older. I think that's something I would agree, actually, which was this lifelong learning. I think that absolutely needs to be a 21st century skill model.
I want to put that to James, the idea that yes, potentially Mariana Mazzucato was right about the relationship between states and businesses creating productive inventions or whatever, but it's happening already. It's happening already in our universities.
Well, the issue there is you'd say that it's falling a long way short of what we could be doing, right? And it's also that this is, if you say let's have a private market, let's have only a private market that's only going to think about what it can invest in right now, you end up with some things funded and other things not. So you take venture capital. Venture capital, it always gets labelled venture capital. There is an amount of venture capital investment happening in Britain right now, relative to what we could be doing, relative to the inventions we could be happening, relative to the skills that are out there that could be developing things. It's too concentrated in London and the South East. It's not happening across the rest of the country, and I don't see much evidence of that shifting without a big push from government to make that happen. So what we want is funding for research outside of the Golden Triangle of London, Oxford, Cambridge. Itself, by the way, a large product of state investment and some directed state investment. And also, I think, a sense, and this is where Mariana gets the argument right, is a sense of saying, okay, it's not about setting a target for government. You will invent this thing. That's not going to work if you say that with government. But what can work is if you say, here is the big mission. Here is the thing we want to achieve. Here is like the decarbonisation target we want to get to. Stepping back from that a bit, here is the kind of areas of battery research, of energy research we want to try and get to. That's the point of having mission-led research. You create the space in which these sort of things can happen. But it doesn't just happen because of the private sector alone.
No, it doesn't. But battery research, battery and storage is the big challenge, and it always has been. I was visiting Matsushita, the home of batteries in Osaka, in the 90s, trying to work out how we could have batteries that would make mobile devices for digital payments last longer. This has been something that's been going on for a long time, and there is loads of money chasing that, because they know if they get it right, then it will deliver a massive return. There is nobody nobody who is more committed and would like to see more building much better high quality jobs in the north of England. You know, I'm from the north of England.
Then who? Then you or the Conservatives?
Than me.
But you're in the Conservative Party. So
and the Conservative
And the Conservatives.
Party. Yeah, because actually...
So what's your evidence for that?
Well, you know, if you think about some of the big regeneration programs, so the other day, talking to George Howarth, okay, so it's Knowsley, both of him and I are trying to do more.
So he's a Labour MP, right?
He's a Labour MP, yeah, for the area. And, you know, there's a lady called Cathy Dacre who's basically behind the Shakespeare for the North, which is a theatre. And Liverpool does have a very strong arts, culture, music, theatre tradition. So, you know, building on that and trying to, you know, sort of broaden that from the city centre to Knowsley, basically. You know, and we're going to meet to see. And he said, we need some help to get this off the ground. And who was he suggesting we meet and see? Michael Heseltine. Why? Because Michael Heseltine was the one who did all the regeneration of the docks in Liverpool, which was seen as, you know, the big step really to make the city fantastic again. And then obviously on top of the European capital of culture, it's now transformed the whole city. And we do need to look at opportunities to grow those ecosystems for sure, because what you find is they do naturally grow. So in Cambridge, it came out of, you know, some of the scientists that came from there, and obviously you had the analytics and not just Cambridge Analytics, but you had, you know, autonomy and, you know, some of those big companies. And then you create an ecosystem and you do end up with those kind of, it's like money attracting money, people attract, you know, you do end up with these kind of things building and therefore you do need to seed fund them. And we have a massive opportunity to do that, mostly because technology means it actually doesn't really matter where you're located now in terms of how you work and how agile and how people work, because the technology allows you to share everything really easily. And that's been a massive transformative effect. And we do, I mean, I think we will, you know, build on that and take full advantage of that. It's happening already in pockets, but, you know, you're right, we need to turbo boost it so that we have... And it's helped solve the housing crisis to some degree, because then, you know, other people can be enjoying buying their first 3-bedroom house for less than £60,000. You could even move up there yourself, Michael, and you should put your show from there. And, you know, you could afford a 4-bedroom one up there.
Well, not at my current income. I don't think there's anywhere in England where I could get a 4-bedroom house. But anyway, James.
No, I'd agree. I mean, I think this is a point of agreement on solving the housing crisis in London. It's solving a jobs crisis in the rest of the country, right? And actually, look, the housing crisis got so bad. This is starting to happen in London anyway. There are people moving out and going to the rest of the country. So there are bits of that happening. Where I take issue with is that the economics of this, I don't think is quite as clear cut as like anybody can work anywhere they want. What you see quite strikingly after deindustrialisation, which we talked about, after the last sort of 20 years or so, globalisation, is an enormous concentration of economic activity in a few hotspots, and lots of other places falling by the wayside. I mean, that, you know, we can talk about the regeneration of Liverpool or Manchester or a few of the other places.
Yeah,
in
lots
the
of towns have fallen by the wayside.
Exactly.
You're right.
But also, you don't have to go that far out of, you know, Manchester. Certainly, Manchester
City
Centre.
Wigan's a great example. St. Helens. I stood in St. Helens.
Well, there you go. So you can see that the model of, right, let's allow this sort of, if you like, globalised, deregulated, the private sector is going to lead model of development to take place. It doesn't actually deliver very much for everybody in those places, and it jams everything into city centres. We were talking about this before we started, that you then end up with a housing crisis smaller than the one in London, but nonetheless in the centre of Manchester or Liverpool or wherever it might, Leeds, you know, wherever it might be. So we have to think a bit more about the geography of what we're doing, and we have to think about there are actually potential in places like, you know, Wigan or St. Helens or Burnley or wherever.
Absolutely.
That we have to
reach.
It's
the same talented people.
But it isn't going to be by saying, okay, we'll just allow all this investment to flood in where it wants to go, and where it wants to go is more or less where it's already successful, and that will just pile up, and hopefully this will, in the phrase, trickle down to everybody else. It hasn't happened.
Well, to some
degree, it hasn't
degree,
happened
but
graphically.
You know,
over
my
the last 10
husband
years.
has just spent, you know, the last 35 years working in tech, and Fujitsu was the last company. I mean, they moved loads of their places from around the sort of London M4 corridor, and they moved him to, in fact, Bootle, I think they had somewhere. They had somewhere in Scotland, somewhere else. And they did. And why did they move them? Because they could get access to highly skilled workers who were really looking for a job. And actually, don't forget, in this country, we have 3.8% unemployment. There is a massive shortage of talent. That will also drive people to really want to go to where it's less competitive for labour.
We're going to jump to question time. So I'm going to start collecting your questions. Whilst you're writing your questions, I'm just going to throw the Brexit question onto the table. You keep writing those. You keep writing those questions. First of all, I mean, what is my Brexit question? It just feels like you have to do it at this point in time, doesn't it? What, James, I feel like you used to be a Eurosceptic and now you're backing a second referendum.
No, I'm still a Eurosceptic.
You used to be a Europhile and now you're saying we've got to leave on the 31st of October. So fight.
I never called myself anything. I was never a Euro anything. In fact, I never woke up in the morning thinking about our relationship with Europe. Just like most people across this country did not wake up before 2015
just
thinking,
like me, to be honest,
what's our relationship with Europe about? We have created this, and for that I'm deeply sorry to everybody. But the reality is, the reality is, it has been a running sort of, people have been very uncomfortable with aspects of our relationship with Europe, not from when we entered with the common market, but probably more specifically after Maastricht and then the Lisbon Treaty, where these growth in powers and things were really creating concern for people. So we did have to answer this question about, where are they going? Where are we going? What's the right model for the future? Unfortunately, obviously, we've done it via a referendum, which means, we've got the people's answer, but we don't really have clear direction as to what that answer should look like. So we've had all this discussion about whether we should leave with a deal, we should leave with no deal, what's wrong with Theresa May's deal, how a Jeremy Corbyn deal would be 10 times better than a Theresa May deal just because he asked it. And the reason all of that nonsense has existed is because in a hung parliament, you get opportunism. And what has happened is the hung parliament, so there's, very, very small majority, and therefore anybody who wants to get power, whether it's the Labour Party or whether it's other leaders, has basically, in my view, created even more uncertainty over Brexit and made it more divisive and polarised across the country. We now need to bring the country together. We do need to deliver Brexit, but we need to deliver a sensible Brexit, an orderly Brexit with a deal, and we need to do it in very short order. One of the things that's really clear about this so far is Theresa May's deal, which some people hated, I thought was perfectly okay. Not brilliant, but all right. 90% of Conservative MPs did vote for that. Mm-hmm. All the leadership contenders actually eventually voted for that. But unless we can get some of our Labour Party opponents to also vote for that, for anything, actually, they need to vote for some kind of Brexit. And some of them have, about 6 of them have, but none of the, many of the others haven't. And my fear now with Labour is they feel as though they're moving more towards a second referendum with Remain position. And if that is the case, then they're not going to vote for anything apart from a second referendum with Remain. And actually, it doesn't solve anything because we then go back to the country with exactly the same question, probably getting a very similar answer, and still no further on.
Right, we're going to come back to James on Brexit. Just before you start speaking, I just want to say thank you to Dr. Pandemonious, who is quite consistently telling everyone to keep hitting the like button, which is good. That does mean more people see this video. So follow Dr. Pandemonious's advice. I am still collecting your questions. James Meadway, you can respond to all of those Brexit points.
Cool. Yeah, well, look,
or as many of them as you
about
want,
this has been thrust on us, which most people hadn't really given it much thought prior to probably June the whatever 2016 or around about that time. I disagree. Obviously, I disagree about Theresa May's deal. I think it's an absolute terrible setup, and certainly not something any Labour MP or anybody remotely on the left or progressive.
Can you say why? Because
the specific on that one, I think, is it's actually not so much the withdrawal agreement, although that has its own problems. It's the outline political declaration, the future direction you
That's
end up
why
in.
she separated them, right?
Yeah, exactly. So, but this is why the thing arises one lump, and if we have 100 days or 101 days from picking the new or the Tories picking a new prime minister to actually trying to leave on the 31st of October, time is not entirely on our side at that point. So the detail of that one is that you still end up with state aid and competition law. You still end up with a level playing field. You still end up with ECJ oversight. This is in the outline political declaration. This is something you should reject. The broader thing is some of the issues raised about the customs union and what
to
what
try
you
and
do with
keep
the backstop.
frictionless trade, right?
That's exactly it. It's basically, I mean, look, what it does is says, we really want to end freedom of movement and we will pay almost any cost whatsoever to trying to get to that point. You don't end up with frictionless trade, you end up with actually quite a hard version of Brexit out of this. But my particular concern is that if you're saying, well, let's create some space for a future government to actually try and do something that breaks with neoliberalism, that doesn't do quite what the European Union would expect countries to do, because we are going to have to, bring into public ownership various bits of the privatised utilities, then something like what that outlined political declaration, it's the only thing on the table at this point in time, is a huge problem. So I'd say that this is absolutely to be rejected by anybody, certainly anybody on the left, anyone progressive, and no Labour MP should be voting for it. Even if it's got down to like, oh, we have to vote for something just to try and deliver Brexit, absolutely not.
Have you worked out why everybody else, all those countries that you talked about, France, Germany, etc., have been able to do what you want to do and still be part of the European Union?
Yes, it's basically because there's a sort of ratchet effect on it. I mean, what you're talking about here is, I think the ratchet effect is that if you have something in public ownership, it's relatively easy to keep it there. If you don't have something in public ownership, it's harder to move there. Now, there are ways around this, and I don't hold to the view that there's some absolute barrier that the EU will impose, and that's
Sounds
it. Sounds
negotiable, right?
It's always going to be negotiable. So there's something negotiable around what you want to do in leaving the EU, but if you've made a firm commitment to keep these things in place, to me, it starts to sound like actually this could be potentially firmer than if you have, as of right, access to the single market, as of right, you're a member of the EU, or at least a single market, and you potentially have some more space in this. So there are problems in this. There are fairly deep problems. I think there's a deep, if rather subtle problem around the issue of losing passporting rights and the kind of blackmail potential that this creates against a future British government. If you only
are you talking about data?
All right, what I'm going to do is I'm going to interrupt here at this point because I want to get through some questions. The way I like to do this is almost quick fire. So you're going to get, for each question I ask, you're going to get a minute each. Obviously, it's nice to have the last word, so I'm going to rotate, if you see what I mean.
Yeah.
So you're going to go first on the first question, which is, let me have a look. Question, I think this is from Phil BC. Why does Gillian think the Tories have got a big problem with voters under the age of 50, and what does she think her party needs to do to win them over?
I think we are not diverse enough. I think we need to look more diverse. We've still only got 20% women. Whilst we've got women in powerful positions, we've got the Home Secretary, obviously, is first Muslim Home Secretary, but still we don't look and act diverse enough. I think we probably have suffered from not having a very good social media campaign in the last general election, and certainly Momentum and people like that. They got
you
some...
had Momentum. It didn't last long.
It's still going, but it's. I think that has a different audience.
Yeah.
I'm not sure if it was the same audience. So we do. I find when I go into universities, people have a completely a false impression of what the Conservative Party is and people who they are and how they represent. But they could also quite equally meet somebody that they think that person looks completely like a Tory, and it's not what I like. So we do have to work on our brand image. Obviously, Brexit's not going to have done much for it as well. We do have to work on our brand image, and we do have to make sure that people see the real Conservative Party, the one I joined, and why I'm a Conservative.
James, same question.
Why the
Conservatives have a problem with the young? Is it just a branding problem?
No, it's a 2008 problem. It's the consequence of the financial crisis problem. It's the fact that if you look at what's happened to young people's wages since 2010 in particular, it's the introduction of tuition fees at £9,000. It's a stack of issues. It's 0 hours contracts, which disproportionately affects the young. It's the housing crisis, which we touched on. These are all kind of real world political issues that I think an awful lot of young people don't see the Tories coming anywhere near addressing.
There's virtually no 0 hours contracts now, by the way, in terms of the
We've got to do a
percentage.
minute. We've got to do a minute each.
They've gone massively down.
Go on.
The ONS figures are still quite high in very high in 0 hours contracts. I mean, it's hugely up on what it was. The last I saw was about 850,000. I think that's the count for 2018 at least. I mean, perhaps all 850,000 disappeared, but it's not as high as it was in 2016.
And that's
I think
a small percentage of the overall
All right, James,
population.
you get to start on this one. Anthony Sylvester, question. The government doesn't have its own money, only taxpayers' money. So that was something you said earlier. If only the Bank of England has the authority to create sterling, where does the money I pay my taxes come from?
That's a slightly confused question. I mean,
it's a question about modern monetary theory.
It is lurking behind it, which is that the Bank of England doesn't have the authority, or it does have authority to create sterling, but most of the sterling you use is created by the private banking system. So we can start with the premises as correct rather than ones that aren't. The reason that you end up charging taxes is very simply that you want some stability to your sources of funding for a long period of time. That if we want to end austerity, and this is why we said we will end austerity by increasing taxes places for big corporations and people earning more than £80,000 a year, then to build that stability into the system, to ensure that is there over a long period of time with potential changes of government and all the rest of it, you need the tax base to do that. So you can't just say, oh, well, let's have the Bank of England print money. This is nonsense.
I think you're going to agree on modern monetary
I do,
theory.
and the difference I would have is that I believe that I believe a Corbyn-led government, and some of the measures that would be introduced would actually reduce overall the tax take, because you would have fewer businesses here, you'd have fewer jobs here. Now, that's my belief based on my experience, but that's the risk. And I think what they need to work out is what happens if that's not successful, and actually it does bring in less money, because I think we would both agree for the spending commitments we need to have as much money as we can.
Right, this one starts with you. Question, this is from Average Joe. Does Gillian accept that Overton window is moving to the left in both the UK, with Labour's policies polling high, and in the US, where the Democrats are also shifting to the left?
What was that first part of the question?
Do you accept that the Overton window, so the range of policies which the public deem acceptable,
Tell this guy I went to a nosy comprehensive school and we did not study Overton windows, whatever it is.
What the Overton window means, the space in which policy is acceptable. So a no-deal Brexit has recently entered the Overton window, but also, let's say, owning 10% of, John McDonnell's plan to have workers own 10% of businesses.
And his question is, do I think that...
Are you worried about the shift to the left, basically, in politics in the UK and the US? Or do you recognise that there is a shift to the left in the UK and the
No,
US?
I think there's polarisation. I think there's a shift to the left and a shift to the right. And I don't like either, actually. I like sensible, moderate policies that, you think about.
Do you think the centre's dying?
I hope not. I mean, I don't know whether it's me. I don't like taking risks.
Why do you think it's struggling? Let's say.
Oh, I think it's identity politics is one aspect of the way that the discourse has changed, and actually, I suppose polarized views disseminated through very successful social media campaigns are something we're going to have to get better used to. And the centre's hard to sell, right? It doesn't sound quite as sexy as some of these things. You're going off to, to be sovereign nation, completely free, blah, 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 or, everything's free. It doesn't really cost anything. All my economic policies, which have never been proven anywhere apart from Venezuela, that didn't work, are actually going to bring up with a different British version of that, and they're going to bring up loads of money. And so, these are all really easy things to sell. One things I've found about politics is actually that real high level. The people believe what they want to believe sometimes.
All right, James gets the final word on this question.
What are we going to do Venezuela? No, we're not. I can't see a single thing in what Labour's proposing that's like Venezuela. The examples I've given are Canada, Germany, and maybe a pinch Sweden. But okay, is the centre? I agree in the polarisation. There is a polarisation. Why is that happening? Because the existing economic model, in a really fundamental sense, isn't working, and it's not like you can sort of tinker around the edges to change that. You're going to have to do something big and fundamental. Do I think it matters that the centre isn't there? Yes, because I think whoever wins the next election wins it by defining the centre, not by standing in the centre because it's crumbling, but by defining what the centre is. If we can own the common sense, and I think we will start to own the common sense in the economy, so ending austerity, the two contenders for Tory leadership are now basically talking about that. They're going to spend a load of money. So we're defining exactly. So we're redefining the common sense in the economy. That means we can win the next election.
Jack Davenport's disappointed about the MMT answer, but we're not going to go back to that because I think that's worthy of a whole show in and of itself. So look to that for the future. I think this question goes to James first, doesn't it? So, Matthew Shearing, I live in the Lake District and can't afford a home here precisely because of people from the southeast owning second homes up here, driving the prices up. What would you do about the housing models? That's James first.
Yeah, that's a very fair point. Really good report by George Monbiot and his collaboration on Land for the Many. I think there's a need to make sure...
There was an episode of Tisky... Sorry to interrupt you, but there was an episode of that 2 weeks ago on Tisky Sow. You should watch it with Laurie McFarlane.
No, really good report, very clear. Distribution of land in particular is, 1% of the country owns 50% of land. You can see that this is going to produce all sorts of weird, horrible distortions all over the place. I think we need to make sure that speculative assets are taxed properly, let's say that. And I think we also need to look at the distribution of jobs and work and ease some of the pressures on housing in places like London and other big cities.
What do you do for Matthew Shearing? How do you change the housing model?
And Matthew has a problem. In fact, a lot of people where there is tourism. So I think Cornwall, Devon, in my constituency in Selsey, the Witterins, there's a lot of people that own second homes because they're basically summer holiday homes. And it is very much a problem if you're trying to get on the housing ladder. And, Chichester's 13 times average earnings to salary, to price of a starter home. And it's impossible. So the only thing you can do is build more houses that are of the right affordable level. And we have an issue, and I'm sure it's the same in certain parts of the Lake District, which are beautiful, which is why everybody wants to go there. But, affordable homes that are built are 80% of value. Well, 80% of value in Chichester is still pretty unaffordable, so that's why we need more social homes. And that's why I've been round with Hyde Housing. We've looked at all of our social housing, looked at all the opportunities, and I'm very hopeful that they're going to bring forward a plan to build more. And I think that's the same problem that they're going to have in the Lake District and other places that people go on holiday for second homes. Now, I don't think we should ban second homes. We do actually charge higher prices for second homes in terms of council tax and stuff like that. And in terms of land, one of the things I was very shocked to learn upon becoming an MP and looking at all this in much, much greater detail was how much land the church owns. Yeah. And that is, I think, a bit of a scandal because, you've got people saying, gosh,
I like your niche policy of going after the Church of England. You know how the Tories lost the last general election was going after their natural base, which is old people. The next general election, you want to go after the bloody Church of England.
I'm not going after them, but if you
expropriate the Church of England. I back the policy. I'm just saying it's risky for you guys. If you can nick land off
people, then
risky for you guys.
But I understand. But if you remember, the Archbishop of Canterbury did this big speech about we need more houses, more houses, and I thought, well, give us the land, and every council will build them. So I think we do need to look at that because, of course, unlike many others, the church probably, I don't know if they bought the land in the first place or how they got it.
I think Henry VIII acquired it for them.
I think he acquired it for them, yeah. So I do think the church, they do a brilliant job in communities, the churches, but I do think they could be a little bit more free with some of their land.
All right, I've got a question from Classic Jag Lover. Really, Michael, I want to know how Gillian can choose dead people. Or doesn't she realise that's the choice she made? So that's a question basically about the 120,000 people who were killed by austerity. So I suppose it's a question about how you, I suppose, emotionally relate to that fact, sort of like the human consequences of austerity. Because obviously you've given a sort of intellectual argument about how you think that because of the dead money and the debt, etc., etc. And we had a sort of economic debate about that. But in terms of the human costs of austerity, which is something we talk about a lot on the show, how do you, I suppose, deal with that personally?
I have no idea how they have calculated that or what
I think it was in the BMJ, wasn't it? It was the British Medical Journal said that 120,000 people were killed. Or
based on what? What did they measure?
Well, I mean,
excess deaths is what they call it. So in other words, it's like
excess deaths
allowing
in hospitals.
Yeah, it was from cuts to social care and health funding, and you can see this impact in other ways. I mean, life expectancy. We were talking about this earlier.
It's gone up massively.
Well, life expectancy has actually fallen over the last year or so, right? So particularly for the over age of 65, because of the impact of spending cuts. So that actually produces an impact in terms of mortality. So what they're saying is mortality has risen as a direct result of spending cuts in these particular areas.
Against the trend, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. So it's 120,000 more than you thought.
We generally, unless you have a sort of crisis like the opioids crisis in the United States, we tend to expect that as technology and lifestyles improve, you're going to get an increase in the average age, or the average life expectancy. Sorry, that's the word. But this plateaued somewhat when the Tories' austerity plan.
I mean, I'll look into that figure. First of all, this is very typical, right, of the kind of comment. So sometimes, honestly, because I have a different political view and a different journey in life, right, people try to paint out as though Conservatives are not nice people. We are, my best mate is a Labour supporter. My nan, my granddad, everybody was a Labour supporter. They know that I would do anything for anybody and that I genuinely care to get the right answer. It's actually why I've come into politics, why most people who come into politics. So this kind of identity of, having to make hard choices, because you do always have to make hard choices. Government's not about easy choices. It's about really horrible choices, because of course you'd like to, spend as much as possible. But having to do that makes you sometimes, somebody who's deliberately tried to kill people. That's absolute not true.
I don't think they said deliberately.
And actually, if you look at patient safety in hospital, which was something that Jeremy Hunt very much focused on, he's done a massive turnaround of increase in patient safety, which was actually people who were dying either because of bugs due to cleanliness in hospitals, or excess falls, or dehydration. So there's been a lot of focus on getting the right outcomes. I think one thing I would agree with is everything we do has to be outcome based. We need to look at not how much you spend and what you put in, but also what you get out of it.
Do you think austerity was outcome based? Do you think they paid enough attention to what were the consequences of those policies and reassessed accordingly? Or do you think there was a sort of arbitrary or a somewhat arbitrary sort of decision made about how the debt should decrease, and then there were human costs that they didn't really take into account?
I think they felt that it
didn't decrease, by the way. This is
no, the debt's still going up, because all the deficit, which was the difference between how much money you bring in tax and how much you spend, was massively out of kilter. It was like 150 billion. So we're spending more than we were bringing in every year. And that was just bringing more and more debt. So we've now reduced that down, quite considerably. But still, we are still spending more than we bring in as a country. So we are still not where we need to be. However, the economy is starting to really fire on all cylinders. We've got loads more to do on that. We've talked about a lot of it, but there's a good base for that to happen. So no, the debt is still, every year we're still spending more. But we've got more people, and I think largely more people with more complex needs. So those kind of figures used in that way, and also some of the UN rapporteur, or his use of
the Tories don't like the British Medical Journal or the UN.
No, and they are political. They are political. They have a political element there. So
the BMJ, the doctors,
the British, the BMJ is very one of the most highly successful unions in the country, I think.
But the British Medical Journal is a reputable medical journal.
I'm not saying
this is a peer-reviewed bit of research. I mean, look, you are right about choices. The choice is that you can cut corporation tax.
But I've already said that brought more money in. We have to get it fact. Well, yes, but I honestly think I'm right on that. So let's imagine I'm right. Then what would you do?
Well, let's imagine that you're right to cut corporation tax and you bring more money in. Well, if I imagine the world worked very differently to how it does.
No, that's how it works.
Then if we imagine that your version of the world was in fact what's happening, well, Laffer curve doesn't exist, and this is like eventually.
Oh, okay.
Eventually, you can hit something. Eventually, you can. I'm quite surprised you raised that one. This is like it's quite high up on your list of discredited things in economics. Is the Laffer curve?
If you start off with a,
I want to explain. I should probably explain very quick. I mean, we're going to end pretty soon, to be honest. But the Laffer curve is the idea that there's can I draw it in the air? It's the idea that if you can reduce tax. You can reduce the tax rate, and then people spend more or invest more. So ultimately, you get it back. But one of the problems with the Laffer curve is no one knows where the optimal tax rate is.
No one knows where the optimal tax curve is, and also changing taxes generally sits in with a whole load of other things governments doing.
That's true, but Treasury
Review turned out to be wrong. Treasury Review took a view in 2010 that the multiplier, which is the impact of these tax cuts, would be small. The forecast they produced in 2010 said we will cut spending, we'll have a massive boom by 2015, austerity will be over. This turned out to be very, very seriously and dramatically wrong. They grossly underestimated the size of the multiplier impact from these spending cuts, and as a result we end up with an economy that's in a much worse state now than it could have been because of those spending cuts. This didn't work.
But as you know, the biggest impact,
we can make a choice to do something daft, but we probably shouldn't do
I doubt they're going to elect Corbyn, but the problem is that if you look at people's spending, right, and I was very struck when I was talking to you, Michael, about how London-centric your view is. Of course you're a Londoner, you're from London, etc. But if you look at it, the problem that young people we talked about, rent costs is a massive proportion of their income, and that is a big change, right? It's just going up and up and up. We haven't built enough houses over generations, actually, probably 20 or 30 years. We haven't been building enough houses.
Who was in power?
Different governments.
Yeah,
over those times. Actually, we have now. We have now built more houses than anyone has in the last 30 years in the last year. So 222,000. I think they
James,
think
you
it
probably
should be
agree that New Labour are
300,000.
also shit on building.
Yeah, they were crap as well. Yeah, no, I agree with that.
And in the right places as well. So, and that is actually what's driving. And I get it. It's. And I say to people, I get a lot of people in my area who don't want more building because, of course they live in a very beautiful area and, they like the view they've got or whatever. They like the fact that there's not as much traffic on the road. But the reality is, I say to them, the people who are struggling actually are people exactly like you 30, 40 years ago. But the house prices have gone crazy in the southeast and in certain areas, and we need to address that because it's absolutely critical, and we need to have much more flexible type of housing, and much quicker builds. I've looked at quite a lot of different modular houses that are fantastic. So there's a lot that can be done now, but we really do need to make sure that we turbocharge the building, because that's the only thing fundamentally which brings the rent down. And whenever you give, Philip Hammond was talking about when we increased the tax threshold from whatever it was, I think it was about £7,000 when we took over from Labour. It's now £12,500 before you spend any tax. And, he was kind of, why is this not getting noticed as much? I said, because most of it is probably going out in rent. Whatever you give in tax cuts is probably going out in rent, because it's continually, an increase, year on year, massive competition for the rental market in big cities in the country. So that absolutely needs to be solved.
There's quite a lot to dig out of that. I mean, one of the obvious ways in which you stop rents being a massive part of what people pay is that you start to cap rents, right? Which is one of the options
Sounds
you could be
simple,
looking at.
doesn't it? But why does that sometimes not deliver the right result?
Well, because it depends how you do it. Apart from anything else, you do a good version of it rather than a not good version of it. And in terms
also
of building
the current
more
system's
houses,
not working, is it? So you can always do a policy badly.
You cap rents and you introduce more rights for tenants. I think would start to seriously improve the life of people who are having to rent in London or the big cities.
There are examples of where that's really affected the market, right? And the landlord
well, you're talking
supply.
about quite affecting the market already, which is let's build a load of houses, right? Let's massively expand supply. I mean, I think you do have to match this up with there is an underlying problem with our economic
people as well.
We do have to match up with changes to our economic model. Like, we do not want every single job going to be jammed into the middle of London or some other big city. You want to create them elsewhere. That isn't going to happen in the first instance without a government prepared to make that happen. So unless you are going to get out and say, here is a 250 billion, this is what we're going to spend it on, this is where it's going to happen, that's not even getting out of the starting blocks. Everything else is a bit like, oh well, let's try and do something. I mean, I was watching.
What's this 250 billion
well, this is
that's going to solve that?
Well,
I know that's your manifesto.
Yeah, it is. All right. So that's the amount that would move us from being about the lowest in the OECD.
A trillion.
It was 250 billion capital investment over 10 years. So it's an amount that would move us from being about the lowest in terms of investment, public investment in the OECD, to around about the OECD average.
Yeah,
now,
but what are you going to get for it? What are you going to get for it? What are you going to get for it that's going to mean that your rent is suddenly much lower?
Well, I think one of the things that, well, it's the same with house building. You build a house, it doesn't mean that your rent immediately goes down. Take action on speculation, it might start to do that. So you can do that straight away, and that would be a popular demand. And I do think if we're saying let's build quickly, I mean, did you see the Dispatches programme? It was Dispatches, Channel 4 last night, talking about some of the problems of the government has tried to put some money in around Help to Buy and this sort of thing, and it's just encouraged lots and lots of shoddy, quickly built houses. Now, we don't want that to happen. We don't want houses to be low quality that you're then trying to move people into, where suddenly they turn up with like 300, 400 faults that they have to get a surveyor around to fix and all the rest of it, that they don't have proper fire cladding. And
I would agree with that.
Right, so we don't want that to happen. So we have to do this properly. One of the bits of doing it properly isn't just like build more houses, this will end the housing crisis. No, there's an entire economic model that hasn't worked at all, really, for most people since 2008. That model is too much centred on debt. We didn't really talk about household debt, but household debt is back up to record levels in the last few months. That is not sustainable. We can't ask people to go through what they went through in the run-up to 2008.
They've fallen as a percentage of income. From 2010, when we took over, it was 142%. It's now 133%.
It's rising.
So it's actually, well...
Yeah, it bottomed out because people were repaying it.
Yeah,
that's right. Because part of like what happens after the
crash
is people repay.
And the cost of debt servicing remains low. And I'm not saying that's acceptable, by the way.
Well, for some people.
I want to ask a kind of philosophical question, actually, because I feel like it's something that, I suppose, surprisingly, actually hasn't come up that much in this whole debate, which is, I think one of the things which separates sort of the Labour left, especially, from even the Labour centrists, but also the Tory party, obviously, is that people on the left think that you can only solve most of these problems by challenging vested interests and, to some degree, the rich and powerful. So, for example, you talk a lot about how you want rents to decrease to some degree. You want people to be able to get on the housing ladder. So lots of people on the left would say that to do that, you have to challenge the interests of the big landowners, because it's the landowners who are sitting on land. So you can put as much money as you want into the housing market, but if you've got these small group of companies who monopolise a lot of land and they don't want to build on it because they're basically withholding it because they want to keep prices high. So I suppose, long story short, do you think the Tory party have to challenge the vested interests of the rich and powerful, and do you think they will ever be willing and capable of doing that?
Well, first of all, I think ideologically where I'm different is the one thing I guess I've always disliked about the left, the militant left, as it were, is this kind of politics of envy, and also this this hypocrisy that I've seen. And I've seen it so many times, everybody has to go to a comprehensive school apart from my kid. Everybody wants, everybody else has to do this. Oh, look at my fabulous house. And I really saw it loads when I was younger, and it really pissed me off, actually. That's one of the things that I thought, you know what, I don't mind if people have things. I'm not envious of somebody who's worked hard, who has some great things. I think that's fantastic. Well done to them. Even if they got lucky, well done to them. But, but what you do need to do is make sure that there's more opportunity for people like me and people who were growing up in places like Knowsley, going to substandard comprehensive schools, as we all did. They all closed down. They closed the whole of the system down, actually, all 10 comprehensive schools. And where there was not many opportunities, that is where to fix it, not by focusing on what someone else has got, but just focusing on what you need to build to make sure everybody's got the opportunities. I know enough, having gone to a failing comprehensive school in Knowsley, sat every day next to kids who I still see now at school reunions and stuff. Every single one was as talented as anyone I've met in the world ever since, at the top of business, at the top of politics. But they did not get a shot. Some of us did. Some of us got lucky, like an apprenticeship. Some went into certain jobs and got lucky, but the vast majority didn't, and so much wasted talent. So that's where my ideology leaves me to focus, not on people who've made it. Good luck to them.
All right, you're going to get, I think we've been going a while now, so you're going to get a response to this, and then what I'm going to do is a really kind of cheesy, like when they have a debate before a general election and they have to end with a sort of 10 seconds fall to camera.
Oh, really?
And you have to tell...
Why?
I've just made this up now. You can refuse if you want, but I think it'd be fun. You tell the Novara media audience why they should vote. But you're going to have a hard job here. The Novara media audience, why they should vote.
Do you want me to sit on a bar stool as well, just to make it more awkward?
We've given you a beer, so,
You have given me a beer. It's
bit of Dutch courage. All right, go on.
Well, politics of envy built comprehensive schools, built the NHS, so it's just a label.
I wasn't that grateful of them.
It's just a label. But the issue, I think you touched on something fundamental about what's happened since 2008, 2010 especially. We've had economic growth. We have. Not very much, but it's there. But you find, especially if you're young, you're not any better off, and you don't expect to be better off in the future. And that's where people look and think, hang on a minute, they're doing really well. And you can see who's doing really well. And I'm not doing really well. That's the driver of this. And I think it's quite a reasonable thing to think. We've had economic growth. Why am I not better off? The promise of the economy is broken down at that point. Now, I don't quite see from what you've been saying what your big objection is to what I've laid out as Labour's programme around investment across the whole country, productivity, high-paying jobs, all that sort of stuff, and saying, and I think we both agree, there's clearly a role for the state in all this, like we talked about this. So I don't quite see where the objection over and above is on top of that. What am I saying that's so unreasonable?
I guess really what it comes down to is, do I trust these guys to manage an economy that has a spend of 900 billion?
Right, I think actually we've kind of
and
had that point, so we're going to do the bar stools moment.
I just don't trust them.
Well, that could be your bar stool moment. Look at the camera. You've got a minute. This is it.
The bar stool moment. I did say to a lot of people after that, I said, honestly, my whole life has been leading to that. I could sit on a bar stool for hours and not look silly. I've done it loads of times. I guess, the people who listen to this programme are not going to be natural Conservative supporters. Hopefully, well, first of all, thank you for listening. And I do hope that, you're not all going to give me a whole load of abuse on Twitter. But in terms of...
our audience, be nice.
So, no, I mean,
Sorry,
but you do get some of that. I think the message I have is, I've been a politician for 2 years. I haven't been a politician all my life. I haven't spent decades voting no. I've spent decades trying to create wealth from a very, very humble beginning, I guess, to try and create, money for myself and also for the businesses that I've run. And I've only been a politician for 2 years, but here's what I've learned. Most people who go into politics actually do have the same objective. They do want to fix things. They do want to solve the issues that they see, whether that's young people like where I grew up and their access to opportunity, or whether that's people being able to get on the housing ladder, whether that's fixing issues with our health service. Cancer diagnosis is still not good enough. It's still not where it needs to be. Access to precision medicines isn't where it needs to be. All of these things need to be fixed. The question really is, who do you think has got the best plan to try and do that. And really, when you're trying to figure it out, for me, I always looked at who is going to be best grow the economy. And the economy, therefore, you have more money to spend. And that, for me, I'm sorry to upset any Corbynistas or people who are think this is the answer, but Corbynomics or whatever it's called, it isn't a thing. It won't work. I honestly don't really want to try it as an experiment, but I just don't believe it. And I don't believe it because I spent 30 years in business before going into politics, and I just kind of know how things work. And I just think I'm more credible on it than he is. And John McDonnell, for that matter.
All right, Meadway, you've got your Barstool moment, your camera's
Barstool
there.
moment, all right.
Sorry for doing this to you both.
The issue... We've had economic growth, not very much economic growth since 2010, and the problem is that most people are still worse off than they were in 2010. So the issue is not that, like, who is going to tinker around, who's going to make things a bit nicer, can we carry on with things as they were? The issue is we're going to have to make some big structural changes to how this economy operates. We have an economy at the minute that I don't think enough of it is producing wealth, whether it's from businesses, whether it's from anyone. Too much of it is rent-seeking of one form or another. Too much of it is exactly the fact that you have landlords charging rip-off rents in places like London. Too much of it is purely speculative activity in the City of London. Too much of it looks like this. Not enough of it is doing what capitalism is supposed to do, which is deliver investment, deliver productivity increases, and therefore deliver wages. And on top of that, you have this extraordinary inequality of wealth and opportunity in this country that has built up really now over the last 30, 40 years or so. We have to do things that change this. I think that will be a big shift for this country, but I don't think you're talking about a big shift to something completely unknown. I think a great deal of this starts to look like a big shift to something like you have in Germany, or if you look at Sweden or Denmark, or take your pick from Northern Europe. These are the sort of places that are already putting in place part of what I've talked about this evening. That, I think, is where we can get to. That is how you start to address this broken economic model that we're up against. And until we do something fairly fundamental, the rest of it is just kind of shuffling things about and hoping for the best. That, I think, is a powerful reason to vote Labour next time round.
All right, brilliant. Thank you so much both for doing the Barstool Moment Challenge. I didn't warn you about that beforehand.
Not at all.
Thank you for coming on, James Meadway.
Thank you.
Gillian Keegan, thank you for coming on. There's been lots of comments saying it's good to get a Tory on the show. So it is. I do really appreciate
Have you picked
someone.
out the three positive ones?
No, there was a few of those, right? So I do really appreciate someone coming on who comes from a different
I've really
ideological
enjoyed
background.
it. I grew up with people who had different ideas to me. I am not at all somebody who's closed to listen to anybody's viewpoint. In fact, I think that's an important thing that we all must do.
And hopefully you can send us some more our way.
More what?
Conservatives.
MPs, right.
We don't need you to send us Corbynistas. We've got enough of those.
Oh, yeah. Well, I mean, I'll tell them the beer's good.
Yeah. Thank you so much for watching Tisky Sour. I'm going to say it again. As you know, this is only possible because of your kind support. If you are already a subscriber, thank you very much. You are what keep the lights on, the heat high. If you gave us some more, the heat would be a bit lower. If you are not already a subscriber, please go to support.novaramedia.com. And as you know, our request is for the equivalent of 1 hour's wage a month, so we can continue working around the clock, almost enough, once a week at the moment, but we will up the tempo if you give us a bit more. Please like this video. Please subscribe to the channel. We're almost on 50,000. And share this on all your platforms. Keep your comments coming in. Good evening. Thank you very much. See you next week.